From the darkest corner of the church, she watched him, just as she had done for the last 3 days and nights. She knew his name, David. He had come into her woods, into her world, and now he lay sleeping in her church. She would lead him to her lair far, far below, allow him to come on his own, and then she would take everything from him, as they had taken from her. Hagatha moved from the corner, silent as the grave. A shadowy wraith, she glided across the floor. She stopped directly over him. She was filled with immense torment and hatred as she looked upon him. It was his kind that had tortured her and hers. They had tortured, hung, drowned, or burned her entire family, and she had been made to watch. And after 600 years, her revenge still burned brightly in her black mind and heart. As she had been dying in that noose, she had looked upon them with black eyes and made a promise to herself. She would return for them. She had willed the devil himself from hell to come to her, demanded it of him. And he had heard, been waiting in fact, and he had come. A pact was made, and he touched her dying heart before it went still and turned it black. An undying gift, an unholy gift. After she had grown still and her body swung silently from the neck, the townsfolk tossed her onto a pyre. They wanted to be rid of the witch for good. They would gather her burnt bone, crush it into powder, and scatter it to the wind. But in the ash they found no bone, and some among them swore that they saw her walk from the fire. In the months that followed, she took every man, woman, and child in her blackened hands and made them look upon her hideous face. She smiled at them as she lay her hand upon their breast and burned their hearts as they beat in their chests. Their suffering and terror was everything to her, and it filled her own black heart with joy. And as they writhed in agony, she sang to them in a tongue even she did not understand. It was the tongue of the dead, and part of the gift, and it was hideous, guttural. It was the devil's hymn. All of this raged inside of her as she watched him sleep. She turned and looked up at the woman she had crucified just a moon before David had come, and a dreadful smile touched her black lips. She hoped more would come. Over the years, there had been fewer and fewer, and it had been years before these two had come. She looked at the candles he had placed and saw that they would burn away soon. She placed a new one for him and uttered a dark incantation upon it. Then she turned and moved to the great stone. She moved it effortlessly to the side. Up and over she slid inside like dark water. She disappeared into the gaping black hole. He would come, and she would be waiting. David woke. He was staring at a single candle. The others, he noticed, had melted into puddles of wax. He shook his head. Someone must have placed it here. Placed it while he slept, just as they had placed all of the others. They would have stood over him in this very spot. Why didn't they just kill him, he thought. He was scared. Fear. What a way to live. Every waking moment, every sleeping moment, there was fear. He sat up slowly. He listened without looking. It was dead silent. So quiet that he could hear himself breathing. Unnatural, like everything else in this hellish place. He got out his flashlight, not even bothering to check the phone or GPS. He knew it would be pointless. He slowly, stiffly stood, listening to his joints crack. He shone the light slowly around the room, purposely not aiming it up at the crucified. His hand shook badly as he swung the light. Nothing else had changed. He shut the light off, saving the battery, and he began to accept that it might be a something instead of a someone. What was the point of what they were doing? Was it possible it was all about scaring him? If they had been standing here, they could have easily killed him. Killed him at any point over the last 3 days or nights. He didn't know what to think at this point. He had exhausted all logic and rational thinking long ago, and was now firmly crossed over into the realm of despair and the supernatural. If something had staged this room, it may not need doors to come and go. But if it was a someone, there must be another way in and out. It had to be the door, he thought, some hidden latch. He turned the light back on and swung it toward the door. And as he did this, the beam cut across the altar, and he saw that the massive stone slab had been moved. He held the light on it. That giant slab had been slid to the side, far enough that someone could climb in or out. How much did that weigh? A ton, maybe more. How could he have not heard it being moved? It just didn't matter. He stepped up to the side and shone the light down. There were stone steps, unbelievably steep, and they ran nearly straight down, perhaps 20, 30 feet to bare earth. There was an intense foul smell that seeped from the hole. He stood silently staring. He was meant to go down there. That was clear. Someone, or more likely something, had given him a clear path to follow. It was the only path. He should have been horrified at this realization, but he found that he wasn't. In some strange, horrible way, he found it gave him something close to comfort. A part of him, deep down inside, had come to terms with dying in this place. He had to be honest with himself. After all he had seen, all he had heard, nothing good would come from any of this. Nothing good could come from him climbing into that pit. There would be no door to freedom down there, no rescue party. There would be no light at the end of this tunnel. He continued to stand in silence for some minutes as this resolve washed over him. Then, nodding to himself, he shone the light up to the hanging terror. Whatever lay in wait for him below, he would not be taken easily. He would fight, and fight hard. Then, with more purpose than he had ever had in his entire life, he hoisted the pack, climbed up and over the altar ledge, and without looking back, descended into hell. Once at the bottom of the steps, David used his light to look around, very wary of what might be lurking down here. He was standing at one end of a long, straight tunnel. The ground ran ahead into the darkness, sloping gently downward and away. The walls were roughly 6 feet high. They appeared to be made from stone, but much smaller, and seemingly much lighter in color than the walls of the church above. "Wait, no." "My God," he whispered. Not stone. He stepped closer with the light. Skulls. His heart, already beating rapidly in his chest, sped up even more. There were human skulls, countless, set into the walls. They ran from the ceiling to the floor on both sides, and they stretched for as far as the light would allow him to see. He had once seen pictures of some ancient catacomb beneath part of some city, somewhere in France, he thought, where hundreds of skulls had been set into the walls. But this was no picture from the internet. He thought about going straight back up the steps, but what good would that do him? No, not now. He would not turn back. He swore this to himself, and he renewed the courage and resolve that he had had at the top of those dreadful stairs. He took a knee, dug into the pack, pulled out the gun, and attached it to his side. He also found a headband that had a light mounted to the top. He had forgotten he had even packed it. He switched it on, but kept the much brighter light in his left hand. He now had plenty of light and quick access to the gun. He started off down the tunnel, minding his head as he went. The head-mounted lamp cast wild shadows as he walked and gave the skulls the appearance of movement in his peripheral. He didn't look. His focus was on what lay ahead, or what might lay ahead. As he walked, he noticed the air seemed to be thicker. It hung, and near the ground there was a mist that flowed around his feet, and the smell, it was terrible. It was putrid and came in wafts. Coming up on his left, he noticed a dark spot where the wall fell away. Another passage, perhaps. He shone both lights. It wasn't so much another tunnel as it was just a recessed hole, just a portion of the earth that had been dug away. It ran in roughly 8 feet and turned up. There were no skulls that lined these walls, just filled with roots that hung from the top. It looked as if it might have been dug out by hand. As he stood looking into this horrible hole, he felt a terrible chill run up his spine, and he physically shuddered. He backed out quickly. He felt like he was being watched. The feeling was intense. "Hello? Is someone there?" He shone the light in both directions, but of course there was nothing to see. He quickly moved on. After only a few dozen yards, he began to see more of these holes on either side. He stopped, and all at once he realized the direction he was going. From the way that he had entered the church, and the way that this tunnel was running now, meant he would be walking directly under the graveyard. He also realized he was heading directly towards the factory. He thought about this for a moment. Could he possibly find a way out of here after all? He moved forward. Hagatha lay in the cold, dark, rotting earth like a stone. Her dark gift meant she was eternal, unending. She didn't need sleep. She didn't feel cold or heat. Didn't feel hunger or thirst. She needed nothing. She just was. All that she was vengeance, and all that she remembered was torture. There simply wasn't anything else. And for long periods of time, sometimes decades at a time, she would just lay, or stand, waiting. But now she felt his presence again. She could hear his heart beating, hear his breathing, hear his thoughts, and it filled her with her dark purpose. It was, in fact, the only time she had purpose. Her other gift was darkness. And if she chose, she would simply not be seen by the living. And now David had come into one of her holes, and though she lay directly on the ground in front of him, he could not see. She rose and stood looking directly into his eyes. Her own eyes had been burned away on the pyre long ago, but her dark gift had given her sight beyond. She reveled in his palpable fear and heard him call out. She would play with him for a bit longer. He moved on, down her passage of the dead, and she followed silently behind. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He felt it before, just as intense when he was above ground, from the dark window in the factory. He kept looking behind him, swinging the light around, sure there would be some hideous creature following him. He tried to shake it. Keep going, he told himself. Up ahead, he saw that his light had begun to reflect slightly off of something. He wondered what horrible surprise he might find. As he got closer, he saw that a wall cut through the passage and blocked the way. A dead end? No, not a dead end. There was a door in the middle of this wall. A small door set low, very close to the ground. It looked to be made of iron, the same iron the wall was made of. Surely this wall was part of the massive building above him. It had to be. As he stood, he noticed he was warm, sweating in fact. There was a heat coming from the wall. He laid one of his hands on the dark iron. Indeed, it was warm. He hadn't felt warmth in what felt like weeks. He pressed himself to it and then noticed a low sound, barely audible. He could hear it and feel it in his body. It was a low vibration. He looked down. There was a lever on the small door. It reminded him of a hatch in a submarine. He tried it. It was rusty, but it did give and groaned as he lifted it. The door slowly creaked open. He pulled the gun from his holster, clicked off the safety, checked the magazine and chamber. All set. He holstered the weapon, squatted down, and squeezed through the tiny opening. Hagatha watched him disappear through the hole, and she turned and vanished into one of her dark earthen chambers. It would lead her down and around to the gate. Once through the door, David was immediately hit with hot air, very hot air. He began removing his warm clothes while taking in the room that he had crawled into. It was massive, not so much a room as a cavern. There were rock walls that ran up into the darkness. The floor had changed to stone on this side of the wall. It sprawled out before him and ran steadily downward. The entire place in patches had some strange dark red light to it. He was again reminded of a submarine when just the red lights were on. He saw no source for the light anywhere. The air was heavy and hot. He figured he must be in the bowels of the factory, or even deeper. He removed his jacket, flannel shirt, and his hat. His undershirt was soaked with sweat. He fumbled for his GPS, not for the position, but for the ambient air temperature. 106 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly 41 Celsius. How could it be this hot this far underground? It was the complete opposite of what he expected. He walked on, and every once in a while he would stop to look closely at the light on the stone floor. He himself cast no shadow upon the floor. The red light that lit up these patches of stone seemed to come from within the stone itself. His mind was learning not to question these things. Not for the first time, he had entertained the idea that perhaps he was in some deep, deep sleep, and all of this was some horrible dream. As he got lower and lower, his ears popped, adjusting to the change in the air pressure. He was deep underground. This erased any hope of finding a way out. It was so hot that he felt thermal air currents rushing through his hair and all around him. The low sound he heard at the door grew louder as he went. It sounded like a giant burning furnace somewhere far below him. The cavern grew wider and wider as he went, and the walls on either side eventually disappeared into blackness. and with no ceiling to speak of, it gave the horrible illusion that he was walking down steps from some unimaginable height. David swayed on his feet. His head began to suddenly spin. He felt nauseous and horribly dizzy. He all but collapsed on the ground. His breath was short, hard, and labored. He felt that his life had been drained, sucked from him. He heard whispering everywhere, felt things crawling all over his skin. And then against his will, his eyes were forced closed. He was consumed with terror, and he felt the presence of something hideous, evil, malicious standing over him. Every second to him seemed like hours. His torment tore his mind open and was filled with terrible visions, demons, fire, a burning landscape of the grotesque. Though David was unaware, he laid in this state for a day and a night. Hagatha had willed it so. She stood over him and drank deep his intense suffering. She ached to take his life now in this moment. The suffering he felt filled her black heart. This was her purpose, to devour the living, feed off their torment. Sensing he was near death, she bent, and with horrible hands she lifted him like a sleeping child, turned, and carried him down to the gate of her father. There she would devour his flesh, and her dark father would rip his soul from his body. David woke with a scream, and his body violently twisted. In his dream, something had grabbed him, carried him. There was a face, a burned, black, demonic horror of a face. Still half sleeping, he tried to run. Flight response was in full control. He could not move. There was a flood of pain, intense pain all over his body. He fought wildly to move. Fully awake now, he looked around, eyes darting everywhere. He was in a large stone room filled with the red light. He was standing. No. His back was against something. A wall? His arms were held out straight to both sides, both legs together below him. He could not move them at all. He realized he was naked and could see that his flesh was red with blisters. His feet, there was a metal spike through the tops of his feet. He looked over at his hands. Spikes. He remembered the body in the church, crucified. He screamed until his throat dried up and his voice cracked from the strain. The intense pain in his body made him lose consciousness. He woke again. He tried to yell, but he had no voice left. His body, dying from injuries and dehydration, had no tears to shed. He let his head hang, and he prayed for death. He prayed to a God he had never believed in. He begged for the end. The entire room shook, and a horrible, deafening rumble filled his ears. He looked up, barely able to lift his head, and saw that the stone on the far wall was moving. It moved up slowly. The smell of rot, decay, and burning flesh rushed from under the wall, and David vomited uncontrollably. Finally, the wall stopped moving. There was just a pitch-black hole where it had been. Although David was unaware, the intense sound of the wall moving had ruptured his eardrums. His ears bled. He looked into the blackest void he had ever seen. Complete and utter terror. His heart was weakened in his chest. He felt as if he was being pulled. The blackness in that hole was complete. Then from the corner of his eye, he saw something moving towards him. With a great effort, he shifted his eyes and saw her. He immediately knew her name, Hagatha. She had spoken to him in his mind as she came. It was the face from his dream, the one who had carried him, the one who had stripped and crucified him, burned his flesh wherever she had touched his body. His body shook violently, uncontrollably. Death throes, he thought. He was close to death. She stood directly in front of him now. With his last ounce of strength, he willed his head upright to look upon her face. She slowly raised her hand and placed it over his heart, and his flesh seared. It turned red and then black from her touch, and he felt his heart burning inside of his chest. Hagatha's lips moved. She began to sing in the tongue of the dead, the devil's hymn, her father's song. As she looked upon his face, she smiled at him, waiting, willing his terror to wane full. David never let his eyes leave her face. He died with his eyes open, smiling back at her.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system. At the tone, please record your message.
Yeah, hello. David. Hey, it's John, your boss, in case you forgot. Just kidding, buddy. Hope you had a great vacation. So I checked and double-checked, and pretty sure you were supposed to be back in the office yesterday, but we didn't see you today either, so, we're all a little bit worried about you. It is Halloween time. Hope you didn't get eaten by some monster, Anyway, give us a call when you can, David. We just want to make sure you're still alive out there, my friend.